Did you know the NFL season of 1951 was a season of rising stars and close games that really was a turning point in National Football League history? Join us as we take a deep dive in the glory of 51 and the close championship game that made it all so special with some teams you're going to be excited about. And it's all coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to our series on the pre-Super Bowl championship games of the National Football League. We are really smoking through these seasons and really having a great time with some great expert guests from cities, and people have wrote books about the teams that won the championships, and that is the same we have for tonight. We have Rich Smelter, who has wrote a numerous amount of books on the Los Angeles sports and their championship seasons in all genres of sport and even in Hollywood. And Rich is joining us to talk about the 1951 season, and we'll see if you can guess who won that season. Rich, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thanks so much, Darren, for having me on. I so appreciate getting back in the pig pen with you, and thanks for the expert label. I appreciate it. Hopefully I can live up to it.
Well, Rich, when you have written as much context and text and books, you have like a library of books on things that start with the word Los Angeles, especially with sports and movies. You are definitely have the label and the moniker of expert in this case.
Thank you. That's why I have the Hollywood hat on.
Yeah, very appropriate, very appropriately wore.
Thank you.
But Rich, speaking of that, before we get into the 1951 National Football League season and who won the championship, why don't you tell us a little bit about maybe some projects you have going on?
Well, right now I'm working on a project called Hollywood's Glamorous Patriot about Carol Landis, an actress that gave her all for the war effort. She entertained the troops under enemy fire, and she was bombed, she was shelled, she was shot at. You name it, caught malaria. She gave it all for the war effort, and I thought it was a nice story to bring up, and I have her family support on it, and I can't wait for it to come out. And also, we're working on a documentary. Darren and I are on it, so it's going to be a twofold project. So I'm very excited about it. Probably the most excited I've been for a project, if that's possible, because I get excited about them all.
Yeah, you're a very excitable guy, Rich. So that's so.
Really?
We may have to strap them down during the middle of this, folks, but we have some help on the other end. But Rich, you really are excited about doing this project with you on Carol Landis, and we're excited about talking about some football from 1951 tonight. So why don't you lead us off? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the National Football League in 1951.
Well, the National Football League, they just merged with the AAFC, the All-America Football Conference, a few years before that. And the Cleveland Browns were the four-time champions of that league. And then they were brought into the National Football League. And of course, Elmer Layden, the commissioner at that time of the NFL, said, oh, let's give them a football first, see what they can do. Well, the Browns proved right out of the gate that they were amazing, and they beat the two-time defending NFL champion Philadelphia Eagles. They didn't only just beat them, they pounded them 35-10 in the first game of the 1950 season. So at that time, the Browns were a juggernaut. And at the same time in Cleveland that was happening on the West Coast, the Rams, who recently moved to Los Angeles from 1946 from Cleveland, all of a sudden emerged as this incredible offensive juggernaut there. And they were even by today's standards, they were torchbearers for the offensive weaponry that we see nowadays. But at that time, I mean, I couldn't imagine being a defensive coordinator and having to deal with this. They would score basically a point a minute. They were phenomenal at that, at just scoring from anywhere on the field. And they had two backfields, which we'll talk about, and two quarterbacks that wound up in the Hall of Fame, two wide receivers that wound up in the Hall of Fame. Just absolutely amazing talent. And ironically, in 1950, in the 1950 season, at the end of it, the Los Angeles Rams faced the Cleveland Browns, the team that replaced them in Cleveland, and they wound up, no Hollywood script could have been written about that even better. And it came down to a field goal in the last few seconds, and Lou Groza from Cleveland kicked the winning field goal to beat Los Angeles 30-28. So on the plane ride home, naturally, it's a long plane ride from Cleveland to Los Angeles, and it took a lot of time for these guys to, really ponder what happened. And they were so good, so powerful, but they were considered always the bridesmaids, never the brides, the Hollywood heroes, the flash and dash guys, that hung out with celebrities and all. And they just couldn't win the big one, and that was the label on them. And it started to even affect the head coach Joe Steidahar's health. And Joe Steidaher, a phenomenal talent for the Chicago Bears back in the later 30s, early 40s. And so, he was used to being a winner. He was associated with this team. He had him on the cusp of a championship since 1940, since 1950. And even before that, Clark Shaughnessy was the head coach. Then he developed all this offensive weaponry that the Rams wound up having. So they had every doubt there was no doubt that they could have been world champions any one of those 3 years, but they just couldn't get over that hump. So he had a lot of negative press that affected Joe Steidahar's health. He had ulcers. He looked like he was about 20 years older than he was, and it was just eating away at him. And they had to try to make 1951 the year, because all these guys were all reaching their peaks, and it was basically 51 or bust, championship or bust in 1951.
Yeah, I mean, you have talked a lot of what you just said, a lot about what we've been talking about in this championship series, all the way going back to 1945. We talked about the Cleveland Rams winning it. We had Joe Squires on to talk about that championship. Well, you also, when they left, the Rams went to LA, Cleveland Browns and AAFC, all they do is win 4 AAFC national or AAFC championships in a row, and then win the 1950 NFL championship, which George Bazika just shared with us on last episode. And now they're in the championship game again, and the former Cleveland team is playing them again. So Cleveland is really the center of NFL championships and pro football championships here for the last almost half a decade, and it's really a common theme. And Joe Steidaher, boy, like you said, we have talked quite a bit about him with the Bears championships of the 1940s with some of our historians, Jeff Berkus and Jack Silverstein, came on to talk about those 4 championships in the early 40s and mid 40s. And so those are definitely some names we're familiar with. So this is a very familiar piece and people of football that are coming into this 1951 season that you're going to talk about. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the game itself and what was going on and how this game was played out?
Well, it was a rematch of the 1950 championship game. The Los Angeles Rams wound up being 8-4, despite this incredible offensive juggernaut. And I use that word juggernaut often with them because, I mean, they were such a potent offense. And they wound up being 8-4. So they came into this game kind of as underdogs, even though that they were playing in the Los Angeles Coliseum. And the Cleveland Browns had absolutely no reason not to think that they could win it. And it was a real slugfest, and it wound up being a 73-yard pass at the end of the game from Norm Van Brocklin, who was basically in Steidahar's doghouse for a while. And he was very, very fiery quarterback, very passionate about things, and he didn't hold back any of how he felt. So, and Bob Waterfield was the complete opposite of that. Bob Waterfield was a quiet leader where, he was basically a little more laid back. Plus, he was married to Jane Russell, the sexy Hollywood star. So that probably mellowed him out a little bit too. But that's beside the point. But all of a sudden, Steidaher knew that he needed Van Brocklin, who had a very, very strong passing arm, into the game. Tom Fears, Hall of Fame wide receiver, went out for a 73-yard pass toward the end of the game, and the Rams wound up prevailing in that game due to that touchdown. But the Rams they gave everything that they had against the Cleveland Browns. I mean, the Rams had 2 offensive backfields. Can you imagine that? 2 full offensive backfields. You had the bull elephant backfield of Deacon Dan Towler, Paul Tank Younger, and Dick Horner, the only guy without the nickname on there. And these guys were 6'2", 230 pounds. They were big, fast. And they would just pound and pound and pound in opposition. Okay. So can you imagine that amount of tonnage coming at you repeatedly? And a lot of these guys just they were just getting beaten by this. So the Rams would just beat you down a little bit, and then they would bring in this one group called the Ponies, and you had Glenn Davis and a couple of these other guys that were just fast, very, very fast. Vitamin T. Smith and I can't pronounce his name. Please forgive me. Calamar, Calamir. I'm so sorry. I can't pronounce. I had always had a tough time pronouncing his name. Please forgive me, the family of him. But these guys were just incredible backs. And so then once the Bull Elephants pounded them, then the Ponies were able to just run amok on these guys. These guys had 9.9 speed in the 100-yard dash. And then when that didn't do it, then you could throw to your Hall of Famer, Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch on the one side and Tom Fears on the other. Hirsch had an incredible season that year, and his numbers for just 12 game season would blow any stats away even by now. I mean, he was, phenomenal receiver. And he went Norm Van Brocklin went to Tom Fears on a long touchdown pass, and that offense just totally pounded down the Browns, and the Rams wound up winning the championship.
Yeah, that's, I mean, amazing things, people that you're talking about there. Now, something that we learned, that I learned when we talked about the 1945 Cleveland Rams, is that Fears and Crazy Leg Hirsch were both drafted in the 1945 draft by the Cleveland Rams and didn't play that season, and they won the championship.
Right.
It tells you how talented they were. And they didn't have Van Brocklin either at that point, but they did have Waterfield was a rookie at that point. So that's just amazing how they fared there. And the other thing is, probably about a month ago, I did a study. I did an infographic on Pigskin Dispatch that's still up on our front page that tells about the most potent offenses in NFL history and actually in pro football history. I included the AAFC teams, the fourth generation of the AFL and the NFL, all the way back to 1920. And even with the Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady's and the greatest show on turf offenses, the 1950 Rams have the highest points per game that they played, and they had 38.83 points per game in a regular season. Of course, they played less games then, but that's what I based it on. If they played a 17-game season, I based on 17. They played 12 games, I based on their 12 games. So that's amazing. Back then, when you have running offenses, basically, it's not as pass proficient as it is today, based on the rules. DBs could torture receivers all the way down the field and, mug them and steal their wallets and everything else. And, nowadays they can't touch them. But that's amazing that offense, and it's a true testament to the players that you just talked about, both those quarterbacks, both those stud receivers that they had, and those six very talented running backs as definitely very potent. And you can't forget about the offensive line making everything work and giving them some time and holes to run through.
The thing that amazes me, Darren, is um, could the Rams of 51 been as potent in Cleveland if they would have stayed in Cleveland with that whole offense that they had? Would they have been as potent there? Because I mean, you look at, like, let's say the 1949 championship game, which you covered already, and it was a downpour, torrential downpour in Los Angeles, which it never really rains in Southern
Mm.
California, so the song goes, but that day it was a downpour. And that was perfect for the Eagles, offense to grind it out with Steve Van Buren. But um, that game, that it took away from the passing attack that the Rams had. Now, the weather on the East Coast, you have snow, you have rain quite often around during the football season, where the Rams were out on the West Coast where there was sunshiny, 73 degrees is the average, everything's beautiful, dry field. So it was a fast track. So you were able to really experience. Now, again, that's not taking away from that talent because, you know, Elroy Hirsch played in Wisconsin. Some of these guys played in areas that weren't all perfect, and they were still able to execute like that. Glenn Davis, at West Point, it got cold there too, but the West Coast really helped them with that fast, dry track out there for probably, you figure, 90% of the time that they played out there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and that still holds true today. Teams that are dome teams, they didn't have dome teams back then, but the dome teams, we're used to playing in a controlled atmosphere, and there's no elements, everything's dry and perfect. Or teams in southern Florida or Southern California playing in beautiful weather. But we just saw that a couple years ago when the Miami Dolphins, who had an exceptional season, and their offense was, blowing numbers that are very comparative to some of these numbers we just talked about with the Rams. They
Yes.
go into Kansas City and it's 5 degrees and a wind chill, 15 below. They couldn't touch the ball, keep their hands on the ball, catch, throw, anything, block. They didn't want to be there because they were so used to that being in that perfect condition. So a lot of times that'll hurt you. And these teams that are mudders and cold weather and thick-skinned sometimes will fare better in that bad weather because they're used to the inclemency, and the smart coaches will practice out in it when they do
Right.
that. So that definitely weather's always been a factor. It's amazing how it still is today, even with all the modern technology and forecasts and everything else that the NFL players have.
How true. I mean, that's what makes the 51 team so amazing is, you didn't have the same kind of training that you had back, that you do nowadays. Could you imagine taking that team and putting them up against one of the top defenses now, where you give them the training, the nutrition, everything that they have, because a lot of times these guys would come into training camp, 20 pounds, 25 pounds overweight, and they would just sweat it out there. And I mean, they would come in, if you wanted to be a lineman, you would just eat and drink beer all the time. And, you wind up with this big beer belly, come out there. But, so I mean, if you had the specialists like you do now, where, where the kicker wasn't a guard or a tackle with a big belly and he was straight on kicker, and you were able to give them all the tools that they have now, I would say the 51 Rams would probably be one of the most they would be one of the most potent teams around. I mean, equal to, I'd say, even the 84 Dolphins, who didn't win the Super Bowl, but that offense where you were talking about the Dolphins a few moments ago, with Marino, I mean, throwing for, all that yardage and everything at that time. And they reminded me a lot of the 51 Rams. So, and that was 40 years ago. So, I mean, you progress them a little bit more. I mean, I don't see how a defense again coordinator nowadays would probably wind up getting gray hair trying to deal with the 51 Rams.
Yeah, most definitely. They were definitely talent laden and played well as a team. And that's amazing because, the old saying, I think John Madden first said, if you have two quarterbacks, you have zero quarterbacks, or goes something along those lines. Well, definitely the early 50s Rams disproved that theory because they had two quarterbacks, that were playing, every other series, I think, at some points in games, in and out of the games. And had some great continuity out of offense. I never really lost a beat, even though two different styles of quarterbacks, like you alluded to earlier.
Two different personalities. One would be, a quiet leader where Van Brocklin would be kicking you in the huddle and yelling at you and everything like that. But he was effective. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Joe Stidahar usually started off with Waterfield at quarterback and then would, decide to bring in Van Brocklin. After the bull elephants would pound away at the defense, or the pony backfield. And again, I apologize for not pronouncing that gentleman's name right. I'm so sorry. Tommy, I don't, I T- Tommy Calamir or something like that, I believe his name was.
Yeah, you're close enough. I think it is Calamir, but
Calamir.
just yeah. So
And I
we'll
am
go
so
we'll go
sorry.
with that, and we'll take the apologies and
So much for the expert label. But
But yeah, that'd be very interesting. So Rams end up being the 1951 champs, and you did a great job of telling us about that and the talented roster that they had. And no wonder. I mean, the Browns were no slouch, like you said. That was like their sixth or seventh championship game in a row that they had played in, if you count back their AAFC days. Which now the NFL does count, so that's we can talk about it with a lot more relevance us as historians without getting knocked down. Well, they weren't in the NFL. Well, AFC was pretty good because if they can come in and win a championship first year in the NFL, and like you said, the first game of in regular season, destroying the NFL champions Eagles at the time, that's pretty talented. So. And so they were definitely worth being, the Rams and the Browns being in those championship games, first 2 years of the Browns being in the league. Great matchups.
I think honestly, Darren, I believe that, if the Rams would have played anybody else in that championship game, whether it be the Giants or Philadelphia, whoever else was in that. It was in the Eastern Conference with the Cleveland Browns. Or at that time it was called the American Conference and the
Mm.
National Conference. They were divided up into that. But I believe that, and it was a different than the American Football Conference or the National Football Conference. They were divided up, and they were the Eastern Western Division, and then they became the American Conference and the National Conference for a couple years in the early 50s. But I truly believe that it made it sweeter to beat the Cleveland Browns. I truly believe in their hearts. Again, I can't speak for them, but I truly believe in their hearts that they probably wanted to play the Cleveland Browns in that 51 title game to redeem themselves. You know, you lose that game in the last couple seconds the year before in Cleveland, and that was a bitter pill. So I think playing the Cleveland Browns, beating them for the first time that the Browns lost in 5 straight championship games, whether it's the AAFC or their first NFL championship, made it even more sweeter for them.
And it had to make NFL purists at the time a lot happier too, after taking a shellacking year one of the AFC merging their three teams in the National Football League. So,
Yes.
Rich, nice job on telling us that history of that. Maybe you could go into a little bit on, you have some football projects going. You told us about your Carol Landis project. Why don't you tell us about some football books you have out there?
Well, I'm working on I did a series. I started off doing a series called Championship Diary Series. And the first one that I did was on the 1983 Los Angeles Rams, I'm sorry, Los Angeles Raiders versus the Washington Redskins. It's all geared towards Super Bowl 18. And when the Raiders just annihilated the Redskins. But it tells the story about the games and the build up to the whole Super Bowl experience, and it covers everything, how the team was built and all. And that's how I wanted to set up this series. And I just did a book last year about the 1964 Browns called Drive to Conquest. That's geared toward the whole Cleveland Browns season, where I took it from the training camp all the way through the championship game. And I want people to see uh, this series is designed basically not for teams that were, the Golden Boys coming in, but some of these teams that came out of nowhere to win. And I have a list of the teams that I'm working on, and I'm actually doing one on the 83 Raiders now and the 48 Eagles, and just some teams that, weren't supposed to maybe do what a lot of people thought, and there were a lot of animosity, like with everything, you're dealing with human beings, you had human experiences, and these guys, a lot of times they had something stacked against them, and they all rose up to be champions. And I have a series in the back on how the team was built. I give little biographies of them, and I keep it always modern, where I never talk about anybody passing away. Even though, obviously, in the 1948 Eagles, everybody's gone from that team. 51 Rams, everybody's gone, but you always keep them forever young. So the books in the series will always stay relevant. You would say,
Right.
well, okay, he's got this, 3 people passed away and now somebody else, it keeps it relevant, keeps them forever young, and you can always read this and everybody always still emerges a champion at the end. I'm doing some on basketball, the 81 Celtics, the 80 Lakers, and a few other teams that I'd like to do, the Knicks from 73. Just some teams that were stacked against it. They're not long books. They're only about 100 pages, but they tell the story of the season, and it moves in a fast-paced way. And so I'm enjoying those. That I kind of work on when I can. Carol Landis is my main focus, and I'm trying to finish up a book on Benjamin Bugsy Siegel's time in Los Angeles called Hollywood Mob Star. And I'm finishing up on that now, so that should be released pretty soon.
Well, we're gonna have your wife take away the toothpicks that are holding your eyelids open to stay up all this time and work, and so you get a little bit of rest. But boy, we are so excited that you have all this great stuff coming out here. And folks, check out Rich's books. We'll send you links to go to find his author's page on Amazon, and some other places we'll get you to get hooked up with him. And maybe do a little bit of homework, because he mentioned that 1964 championship game. And hint, hint, probably in a few weeks from now, 13 episodes of this NFL Championship Series, we will love to have Rich on again to talk about that. And
So brace yourself, everyone. I'm coming back.
yeah, so get your homework and get that book read on the 64 Browns before Rich comes on here, and you'll get to hear it right from the author's mouth, which is an exciting thing to do. So, Rich, we really thank you for coming on here, sharing all this great history, especially in the 1951 NFL season and these amazing Los Angeles Rams of that era.
Darren, thank you so much for having me. Anytime you need me, I'm here, and I just love doing it. So, I'd love to jump in the pig pen anytime with you. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the projects that I have out.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.